Since the ratification of the U.S. Constitution in 1789, much of America's civil rights history focuses on the intersection of voting rights and citizenship. When the Constitution is first ratified, only wealthy, white, land-owning men could vote. Ever since, it has been an unending fight for most Americans to gain voting rights and to be recognized as citizens. Without going through an exhaustive list of advances in civil rights, I offer a brief presentation of some of the most important fights and advances. For Native American rights, Native American civil rights movement has very much paralleled that of African American civil rights movement. An 1876 Supreme Court decision ruled that Native Americans were not U.S. citizens. Okay. I want that to sit with you just for a moment. Okay. The people indigenous to this continent and to this land were not citizens of this land. 11 years later, in 1887, Congress passed the Dawes Act, forcing Native Americans to adopt white culture and to throw away their native culture. Excluded from U.S. citizenship until 1924. When President Coolidge signed the Indian Citizenship Act, okay, and just 4 years after American women gained the same right to vote. Regardless of the 15th Amendment to ban restricting voting based on race, Native Americans were near universally excluded from voting. Okay. 1958, North Dakota required Native Americans to renounce their tribal membership in order to vote. And finally, it was amended in 1965. The Voting Rights Act allowed election ballots to be finally printed in Native American languages and set a set of laws that are currently being threatened to be overturned. Only one language they want on these ballots. It took until 2020 for North Dakota to finally recognize Native American reservation addresses as legitimate voting addresses. Okay. Hispanic and Latino rights. Okay. Congress passed the Homestead Act of 1862. Okay. This allowed squatters to settle Western territories, but many of these lands were already settled by Mexican immigrants. Okay. And they were not recognized. This allowed white settlers to take the land already settled by Mexican settlers. Okay. The Reclamation Act was passed by Congress, dispossessing Hispanic landowners from their land, just took it right from them. Okay. In 1917, Congress passed the Immigration Act, okay, and to limit immigration, the same year officially recognized U.S. citizenship of Puerto Rico. Okay. And then, in 1921, the U.S. government imposed restrictions on Hispanic immigration for the very first time. Okay. Then in 1954, the Supreme Court decision in Hernandez v. State of Texas recognized Hispanic Americans deserving of equal rights. The same year that Brown versus Board of Education was decided by the Supreme Court. Okay. The decision leads to what's known as Operation Wetback, being launched that very same year, which led to the deportation of some 3.8 million people, okay, all of Mexican descent. Well, now we have Japanese American citizens, okay? The Japanese internment is an ugly scar on the face of America. Following Japan's bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941, the U.S. General John DeWitt, he filed a report with the Defense Department where he stated that, quote, the Japanese race is an enemy race. Okay. General DeWitt's report, titled Japanese Evacuation from West Coast, 1942, deliberately ignores all rights of any of these citizens simply because of their race. Then in 1942, FDR issues the most infamous executive order of all time, Executive Order 9066, ordering the removal and internment of American citizens of Japanese descent in prison camps. Okay? The President of the United States Think about this for a moment. With just an executive order, no trial, no evidence, or any justification, removed U.S. citizens and imprisoned them in prison camps. The government placed 110,000 American citizens living along the west coast of the United States, as well as 158,000 American citizens living in Japan of Japanese descent. It was the entire Japanese population in Japan, or in Hawaii at the time. Okay? They were all placed in internment camps. Then later, 1944, the Supreme Court held in Korematsu v. United States the unilateral imprisonment of these U.S. citizens and the suspension of habeas corpus was constitutional, despite the Constitution actually banning either such actions. Now on to women's rights. Okay. At the very start of the American Union, women held no voting rights, and in most cases could not even own property or hold credit in their own name. The women's suffrage movement, like other civil rights movements in our country's history, was a grassroots effort to gain equality within their own country. Not until 1920 did women secure the right to vote with the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, 55 years after black men gained this right. Okay? And in fact, it wasn't until the 1970s that women even gained the right to control credit and have credit in their own name, okay? Rather than, of course, their husbands or fathers. But I bet you can't guess which state of the United States was the first to grant women the right to vote. Okay? Most people think it's Wyoming. We hear this all the time. But that is incorrect. In 1776, so at the very beginning of the Union, the New Jersey Constitution provided suffrage without mention of race or gender. However, by 1807, they decided to correct this error, and New Jersey amended their constitution to limit voting to only tax-paying white men. Clearly an oversight on their part. In 1869, women's suffrage was passed in Wyoming Territory. Only a few months later, in 1870, okay, the Utah Territorial Legislature unanimously voted for women's suffrage. Then in 1887, women gained partial suffrage in Arizona and Montana, New Jersey, North Dakota, and South Dakota. Okay? Women were able to attain some voting rights in these states. In 1914, Nevada and Montana finally grant women full voting rights. Okay? In South Dakota, women gained full voting rights after an amendment to the Immigration and Citizenship Act in 1918. Okay? So on to African-American rights. We hear a lot about African-American civil rights movements, a big part of our educational system in this country. But following the end of the U.S. Civil War, 3 amendments were passed to the U.S. Constitution that were ratified during the Reconstruction era following the Civil War. The 13th Amendment bans slavery. The 14th Amendment establishes birthright citizenship of freed slaves. The 15th Amendment grants voting rights not based on race, but of course they do not mention gender. However, the amendment never ever mentions a gender, so women must wait another 55 years to gain that same voting right. For the last decade, the Convention of States movement, you might have heard of it, has been trying to trigger a new U.S. Constitutional Convention. And they're doing so with the hopes of removing these 3 amendments. Can you believe it? Okay. After the end of Reconstruction, the former Southern states codified what became known as the Black Codes. Okay? And they did this to regulate black lives. Though some of these black codes existed prior to the Civil War, and even in some northern states, okay, in the South they became part of everyday life. Okay? In 1865, Mississippi, South Carolina, Georgia adopted language in their new constitutions that stated, quote, guard them and the state against the evils that may arise from their sudden emancipation. By 1865, we have Jim Crow era. It's ushered in. Okay, new laws spread around the country, not just in the South. Okay. In addition to segregation, Jim Crow laws were created to get around the new constitutional amendments that provided new rights to formerly enslaved people. Because it was once illegal to teach slaves to read, only 25% of black people in post-Civil War United States could read. The fact led to the creation of literacy tests. Okay. In order to vote, you had to pass the literacy test. So what about illiterate white voters? Well, that's where the grandfather clause comes in. If your grandfather could vote, it didn't matter if you were illiterate or not. Okay? The literacy test does not apply to you if your grandfather voted, so what are you going to do if you're black and your grandfather couldn't vote? Well, you don't vote. To further reduce the black vote, poll taxes were also established. As late as 1939 in Alabama, in a newspaper in Tuscaloosa, okay, they proudly stated that the poll tax protects, quote, white supremacy. Okay. A less discussed aspect of Jim Crow and a less discussed Jim Crow law, which many states still maintain to this very day, is the loss of voting rights for criminal convictions, for felony convictions specifically. Okay. But in 1962, the 24th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution eliminates poll tax, no more poll taxes. And this has affected those state IDs that they keep charging everybody for. Then in 1964, Congress passes the Civil Rights Act to establish African-American equality under federal law. Then again in 1965, Congress passes the Voting Rights Act. And this is meant to reaffirm the 15th Amendment right to vote and equal protection for these voting rights. This was just a very cursory overview of the fight and intersection of voting rights and citizenship in this country. Unfortunately, this fight is unending. We're still fighting it today. When a flurry of new voting restriction laws are being introduced across this country, in the states and even federally, okay, this means American democracy is still and will continue to be in peril. Interestingly, the American democracy only requires two things of all of you here tonight: pay attention and vote. Thank you.